Thank you so much for tuning in to Circling Dialogos. If you are inspired by what we talk about on this channel and want to dive deeper and in fellowship with others, there's a number of ways you can do that. One is to become my client and work one-on-one with me. We also have circling events every week open to the public. We also do weekend intensives for circling every 4 to 6 weeks or so. And we have a year-long Art of Circling practitioner training program. We also have self-study programs that you can do at your own pace. All the relevant links, including my email, is below in the show notes. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Just like do a jam. There we go. Oh, look at these beautiful people. So getting married in July is great, everyone. If you're watching this, it's the perfect time to have a wedding. You burn alive. It's
Yes,
really great. So, it's
totally.
really, really wonderful.
And at least there's mosquitoes too.
Yeah, no, they're really the icing on the cake. I mean, getting like the West Nile disease at in an event that's supposed to be a testament to love, it's really symbolically perfect. It all just goes together wonderfully. Really does. Really, really does.
Yes.
But no, I enjoyed speaking a lot last time, and I hope you have
Me
both
too.
been well. It's always a treat.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about it, but judgment's out about how well I'm doing. We'll see.
Uh, yes, sir. I ask my children, and they say, "You're great. Take us to get pizza." Okay, if I'm great, I can do that. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
totally.
if other people tell you you're great,
Right.
then you can go get them pizza. You have what it takes. It's like, why aren't you great, Dad? I know you just got off work, but you're great. So get us pizza. Oh, I thought I
Right.
was tired. Okay, yeah, I can get you pizza. It's
Exactly.
great.
Hey, you said something just a second ago, something about something mystery. What was that?
Yeah, no, I've been going down a rabbit hole, which is a great place to go crazy or to find the meaning of life. It's always a coin flip, so hope it lands on heads. And I've been very interested in Hofstadter. So I've been going back to Hofstadter because in belonging again to two, there's this question of so there's a few things, and like we talked about, Guy, language between discourse and rhetoric shapes subjectivity. Discourse being on kind of one-sidedness, A is A, algebraic points, kind of flat. Whereas rhetoric would associate more with dialogos, kind of the circling. Another kind of DC Sendler talks about being gathered under beauty, Plato, the apophatic, and different things. And the argument of, a argument of belonging again to one is that the more subjectivity today is shaped according to rhetoric versus discourse, the more that will actually create wealth, that will help us overcome the meta crisis, the meaning crisis, avoid Nash equilibrium, et cetera, so forth. So I'm belonging again to two, because it just, why not just go on forever, right? Is the question of why is this? Why is it that language so much structures subjectivity? Why is language so powerful? It's also going to be interested in why is aesthetic so powerful. So there's a book called Distinctions by Pierre Boulanger. I'm not saying that name correctly, but I tried to slur it so nobody noticed. There's books on kind of symbolism as structuring people. And there's an idea, and the idea that Pierre and a lot of the sociologists talk about is that if you look at a mall, or you look at a room in a set table, there's a way in which the aesthetics themselves tell you if this room is right or not. Or if you look at someone and they're wearing blue jeans, driving a truck, and they have on a hat, the aesthetics say to you middle class. No one says anything, but the aesthetics itself says middle class. And if you saw someone wearing blue jeans, driving a truck, and going to Country Kitchen, and you found out that they were a coder at a computer company and they were an environmentalist, it would be like, whoa, that doesn't match the aesthetics. So the point is that aesthetics speak to us. They formulate our assumptions, and they formulate the way that we think the society and people are supposed to look. So the notion is aesthetics shape us, language shapes us, and then it creates a feedback loop, because then if we associate seeing things a certain way as the right way, then we participate in making them that way. And then if our subjectivity is structured by rhetoric, then we speak according to rhetoric or discourse. So it becomes a kind of feedback loop. And the question is, why? And there's a book by a man named Douglas Hofstadter. He wrote a famous book called Gödel, Bach, and Esker, won like the Pulitzer Prize in the 80s. He wrote a book called A Strange Loop. But my favorite book of him is called Surfaces and Essences. And in that book with Sander, he wants to argue that basically all thought is analogous. Like every thought has an analogous structure. Whenever you think of something, you're able to make it intelligible because you think of something else at the same time. Like when I look at this cup, you know, and the key argument they want to make is a lot of what we think is categorization is actually an analogy and categorization put together. So analogy is basically just likeness. When I see that cup, I say that's a cup. Well, why do I think that? Because it's like all the other cups I've seen.
Yeah.
And you see the key, this is what's weird though, you say, well, that's just categorization. He goes to great lengths to make this argument. But where did the category come from? The category came from constantly apprehending an invisible structure in a bunch of very different particular objects that then you arrive at a metastructure called a cup. Yeah. And then the key is when you see things, you instantly apprehend them according to that cup. Now, it's a longer argument, but basically all thought is analogous. And, you know, there's Aristotle, Plato, Aquinas, they all speak about analogy and different things like this. Well, and then you can even get into Wittgenstein, Solzhenitsyn, et cetera, so forth, name off a big list of names. But anyway, the idea is that language is actually analytical, is analogous. And we can say that rhetoric is actually embracing analogy. And one of the great mistakes we've made is think that language is primarily definitional, that words are their definitions, when really what Hofstadter and Sander want to stress is that words are more like their gathering, which makes me think of the language of experience that Clayton has spoken about. And they talk about halos. I love this term halos. So what they say is words are actually gathering things under a halo, kind of retracts, expands, and that words are more so halos than they are definitions. And those halos are formed by analogy, which then thinks of the gathering of their beauty that Schindler talks about, and then the circling of dialogos. And so what you see in Hofstadter is a large argument of why all thinking, all words, all subjectivity, ergo, is a halo, not just a point. It's a expanding kind of circle versus other. Now, here's the key question from all that, and then I'll close the point. The interesting question to ask, is that halo, because they talk about a strange loop, is that a evidence of some sort of apophatic mystery, or is that simply an effect of reflexivity? And what I mean by reflexivity is just meta. So that I'll talk about the difference between meta and mystery. Meta is self-reference, where I'm referencing myself. I can say, Daniel thinks, Daniel thinks, Daniel thinks. You can always have a kind of loop that you can engage with, right? And so is the halo a product simply of reflexivity in that loop? Or is that halo evidence of a kind of apophatic mystery, where actually all intelligibility forms a kind of halo? So those are some thoughts I've been thinking through.
Yeah, just so I can understand it more. What's at stake in it being one or the other? If it's one, the implications of that are blah-da-da-da. If it's the other, the implications are that. What's at stake in that matter?
That's an excellent question. So what I would say is, if language is definition, then knowledge is memorization. If language, and because the philosophy of language is also going to be the philosophy of intelligibility in general, because language is kind of at like the way we form words. If language is primarily what makes us human, then our philosophy of language directly translates into our philosophy of thinking in general, which then, of course, directly translates into what it means to be human. So if language is definitional, then learning should mostly be about information and the learning of information and learning of definitions and memorization, right? Which, of course, is AI, basically, a kind of disembodied intelligence. But if intelligence is actually more of a gathering and a halo, then education and intelligence should way more be about participating in the formation of that halo and participating in that gathering. And then subjectivity should be formed according to a participation versus a memorization. And what that would also mean is that, to use a James K. Smith way of putting it, which I like from his book on Desiring the Kingdom, and he's a great mind for this, is the difference between information and formation. is, if indeed if learning is more of a halo, then learning is more so a matter of formulation, that in the act of learning, you are formulating yourself and formulating the categories by which thinking occurs, which then works on a feedback loop back on you.
Yeah.
And that would therefore transform how you form society. And what it would also mean is that it is impossible for humans to, say, observe information and not then change that information in a way in the act of it, because we're always in a feedback loop. Like right now, we treat information and learning as being a kind of passive thing.
Yep.
But really, if it's formulative in a halo, then the subject-to-object divide is no more. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So those would be some of the stakes.
Yeah, totally. It's kind of like, it also seems like maybe what's at stake is the collapsing or the removal of the difference between like knowledge and understanding.
Yeah.
Right. Like now, like we can have all this knowledge, right? And evidence for the knowledge, right? That can fill the whole room. But that doesn't mean we understand the significance of the knowledge, right? And is that understanding, right, that seems more halo-like to me in some way. And so what do you think about that?
No, I completely agree. And I think also so if indeed language and words and thinking is more like a halo, then it makes sense that in dialogos, conversations, ideas arise that you've never thought of before. Ideas come from nowhere because learning is the movement of this halo. And so as the halo expands, it begins to include things that weren't included before that are analogously formulated. And then there's a kind of gathering, like all three of us right now make a halo that you could not make alone. And then the key is, what this would also mean, though, is if this has always already actually been how learning has worked, then what we need to do today is realize something that is always already present versus add something, which means the problem of scale should be addressable. Because we've talked before about the great problem of scale and scaling this ability to think dialogosly, circling, childlike in the Nietzschean sense rhetoric. And you're always like, oh, well, if how are you going to get everyone to do that, to deal with the meta crisis? How are you going to get everyone to do that? Wouldn't you have to be kind of totalitarian? It's an extremely important critique that Belonging Again we'll talk about. But if in fact the key to rhetoric is actually an acknowledgement of a mechanism of thought or subjectivity that is always already present in people making the world intelligible, then the problem of scale is actually the realization of something always already present, not adding something. Because if it was adding something, it would risk oppression, totalitarianism, and stuff like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. What are you nodding your head up, Clayton?
No, like hearing all these, the thing that's coming to mind for me is a scenario I was in this morning. Um, so, so this just happened. And I'm still kind of like connecting it this way. So when you're describing that, I was hearing like, you have these spaces which you have to keep traversing. And that's why when you're describing it, I was saying, yeah, you have to do both, right? You have to do both at the same time, because it's both internal, doing the self-reference, and external, and bridging that gap continuously. So in the scenario that happened, like a friend of mine suggested to me I told them I was praying for God's grace. And they said, oh, but God's grace is already given to you. Here's some Bible verses that, emphasize this point. And they said, yeah, I know that. But that is, borrowing Vaveki's model. It's like, that is just the proposition. It's like, I still have to kind of like unpack all the other levels of that same truth and get to know it until it's in me. And so the picture that came to mind was, children go to a local school, right? And 2:30 and you have to pick them up. But if you, Daniel, have never been to this particular school and don't know the way there to pick them up, I could give you a map of the way to school. It's like, here's a map, read it. That's where you're going to go pick the children. But even if you read that map, it does not specifically say that you know how to get there. So you could read the map, but you still have to actually translate the map into the physical world to see how that physical world is encapsulated in this map and how this map matches up to the physical world, right?
Yeah.
For you to actually map it out. And then on top of that, you actually still have to walk that path, like leave this house and walk through whatever path the map is mapping for you to the school and pick up the children. So you all this has to happen. But then say it's 2:30 and the children have to be picked up and you're doing it, Daniel. And I go like, hey, Daniel, so you get the children? It's like, no, what do you mean? I read the map. It's like, yeah, you still have to get the children here.
Yeah.
Reading the map was just was just a piece of the puzzle, right? It's like you still have to get these children back to this spot. The map is just a clue of how to get them.
Yeah.
Right. And so you made you make protesters, but I read the map. That's all I had to do. Right. And you asked me to read the map, I read it, and I'm good. It's like, no, you're not good. The job was to bring the children here. You had to interpret that map into a real world scenario and explore that space and find the children and bring them back. Now, you could do this without the map.
Yeah.
Or you could do it, you could read the map as you learn the world space and actually do this. At whichever level you start, if you don't solve the problem, it's not successful, right? And it doesn't matter how you reconstitute all these pieces of the knowledge, that kind of comes well together to kind of like make the thing happen. And I think that's why for me, like, in that proposition, I'm here, it's like, yeah, you got to do all of it. You have to do all of it.
Yeah.
To achieve the objective. Yeah. So that's what I was kind of like nodding on.
Yeah. Yeah. There's like, I just heard in every step of the knowledge, there's a gap that it sounds like a living creature needs to gather, right? The map and the territory, right? The meal and the menu, right? Like,
and the living creature has a truth sense, right? It has sensitivity to. I describe it as truth sense, but it's more like knowing knowing the optimal aspect. It's like somehow you the creature, that is what you're bringing to this whole equation.
Yeah, and then if we add on that creature who can get the optimal grip between the two to be able to do that, if you ask them how they did it, they most likely, there's some of it they won't be able to explain. They'll say, well, I just did it, right? Like, so it's even knowledge that isn't intelligible to them that they're embodying altogether. So there's this kind of thing that kind of seems to withdraw and call in understanding in its withdrawal, right? This element. I wonder if this has something to do with this whole thing about, this kind of level ontology sense, right? Kind of this Neoplatonic sense of that, like, intelligibility itself isn't intelligible, right? Like, at the level, like, because for it to be intelligible would presuppose the level of intelligibility, right? So intelligibility is a thing that grants or gathers things as intelligible, but cannot be one of the things gathered, right? That structure I'm hearing is like a halo, right? that there is something that always withdraws in our information, in our knowledge, right? But that withdrawal isn't arbitrary, right? Like that withdrawal is the thing that allows it to engage and participate, right? It draws in participation in some sense, right? In this way. I hope you're enjoying this video so far. Just wanted to remind you, if you are interested in diving deeper in what we talk about here on the channel, in fellowship and in a more embodied way, there are a number of relevant links in the show notes, including working with me one-on-one as a client. All the information is below, including my email address.
No, I think that's outstanding. Well, one of the things to that point, you know, in Hofstadter's book on Gödel, Bach, and Esker, he talks a lot about these kind of logical paradoxes. So, you know, the Zeno famous, you know, how do you get to a point if you got to get to a halfway point, a halfway point, a halfway point? The funny thing is that paradox, in a sense, draws in participation, because you know that if you can walk, right? So if you participate, the paradox goes away. And what's very interesting to this point, what I think is critical, is that many paradoxes actually can be resolved at a higher level. So you were just talking about levels in neo-pragmatism. Like, so for example, many of the logical paradoxes of Zeno can be dealt with once you just bring in geometry. You like the halfway point and different things. Well, that's all algebraic, right? Just half of a half of a half. But if there's another dimensionality of height in addition to the width, well, then actually, then you can have diagonals and deal with this problem, right? And without going through many more paradoxes, basically, the high majority of paradoxes are resolvable by adding a new dimension, a new level to the problem, right? So likewise, like let's take the problem that Derrida talks about, the difference of terms, right? You know, difference and different things. So if I ask you to define what a cat is, and like if I ask you, how do you know what a cat is? And you say, oh, well, a cat is furry creature with four arms because that's the definition. Well, how do you know all those words are true? How do you know all those words are true? And difference, words define words upon words define words, you get an eternal regression, right? But if you just bring into that, well, actually, it's because I apprehended it was a cat before I defined it. I encountered, apprehended cat, and then defined it. If I remember the dimension, the additional layer of the encounter, then the eternal regression goes away. The regression only arises when I try to treat the definition of cat as the ground of its being versus the apprehension in the encounter that then I'm trying to define into understanding. So here's the trick. Paradoxes are calls to a different level of intelligibility, which then the funny thing, this is where I think we've made a lot of mistakes. Like when you're talking about the, you know, the analogy of being or the ladder of being in a quiet, there's this kind of notion of intelligibility climbing something, right? The key that's calling, often the call to another dimension of intelligibility is a paradox, not an epiphany, not an understanding, but a paradox that says you're missing a dimension. And what I was saying before on the meta and mystery, what's interesting is like in Hofstadter's work, there's all these kind of meta paradoxes. He talks about when you point a camera at the TV that's hooked up to the TV, you get like the mirror effect where two mirrors are put together, and basically argues that subjectivity is a strange loop as such. Now, I'm not going to say I'm an expert on Hofstadter's thinking, so if I'm misrepresenting, so don't take what I'm saying as his official final position. But the point that he's arriving at is there's some sort of meta eternal regression that occurs when you try to deal with reflexivity, right? But actually what I would argue is that that paradox of reflexivity is actually a call to add another dimension of intelligibility, mainly relation with the other. The problem is the reflexivity of the strange loop is arising because you're thinking of the I to the I, not I as other in a Hegelian sense or AB, or without the subject-object divide. Oh, so the paradox is a call to adding a dimension. And this should be education. This should be what you learn. But what we do right now is we say, oh, words defer into other words. Well, I guess words don't exist then. We just deconstruct them. Well, the self ever reflexes on one another. Well, I guess there's no such thing as a self, right? We're taking these paradoxes as evidence of non-existence when they're actually calls to adding a higher dimension of intelligibility. This is the difference, if you want to say, between a rhetorical education and a discourse rhetoric education. to use my language. And that this mistake of encountering paradox as evidence that the field is dead, or that philosophy is stupid, or the self doesn't exist, has led us into the nihilism, into the meaning crisis, into the deconstruction, when really it is a call to bring into play another dimension of intelligibility. But to do that, here's the trick, to Clayton's wonderful example, and then I'll pass it on. The key is to make logic serve the encounter, not logic replace the encounter. That's where we've screwed up. Because what you're talking about is you're supposed to participate in the territory, going to the school, and use logic in service of the participation. What we've done in modernity is replace participation with logic, which that is the move that gives you all of the logical paradoxes, because logic cannot be its own grounding. Intelligibility cannot be its own grounding. It has to be a handmaiden. It has to be a servant of, in a sense, of participation and of encounter, right? And you see, but the reason why we haven't wanted to do that is because if encounter and participation is primary and then logic, that means you have to go into the lion's den. That means you have to go into the place of risk. That means you have to go do the thing, and you can't necessarily know the results ahead of time. You actually have to get in the car and drive to the school and pick up your kid. And what if you're in a wreck or run out of gas and bad things happen, right? The moment you talk about participation, you're talking about risk, and we want to mitigate risk. So let's just create a logical structure that will tell us everything that's going to happen. But that's when you get all the regressions. That's when you get models that set us up for black swans. That's when we get all the economic fallacies and different things. The encounter leads to the logic, and we're talking about that at the net, versus logic replace encounter. And honestly, a lot of our deepest mistakes are matters where we've made something replace something versus be in service of something. So in this case, we've instead of have logic serve participation, we've had logic replace participation. Instead of having the concrete world be the arena of participation and relation, we've made facts all you need, when facts are nothing without relation, right? So like that's another mistake. We've tried to have facts without abstraction. We've tried to have facts without subjectivity. Well, that gives you kind of a dead world, right? But if instead facts serve subjectivity versus replace subjectivity, you get a very different picture, right? And so I think all of these paradoxes should call us into higher dimensions of intelligibility, but instead we've had them be evidence that intelligibility is impossible, and then we wonder why we're confused.
Yeah. So in some sense, is what you're saying, and in some sense, this without this call to bring in higher levels of intelligibility or discover them, or however we want to put it, if we don't do that, then we have contradictions, it sounds like, right? So there's this, and it seems that there's something really, what I'm hearing is that higher development, discovering, creating, that higher development is it that happens in a participatory mode, right? Like that's the thing. So just kind of a side note, I think I'm kind of getting this as we're talking about this is kind of a little bit what Eckhart is talking about in his non-thingliness of God, right? Like this, he was really claiming that there's, God is not a thing, right? It's not a knowable thing, right? It's nothing like an object, but yet but you can see it through all the things in the objects, right? But if you don't see it or don't relate to the depth of the object, right, that you can't see, that constitutes the thing, right, then you're going to confuse. Then you're not actually going to have a real relationship with the things, right? And so in that particular kind of Christian non-duality, I think more than a lot of other things, so relies on the mode of participation, right? Like the non-duality, right, is this kind of, it's not like there's a thing that's non-dual and then you have illusions about it, right? And if you just remove the illusions, there's the non-dual. It's not like a monoism. It's like it's in this right participation, right? That mutual birthing, fractally birthing out of itself thing that goes is the really real. It's not in the relata, it's in the relation, which I think is when I think about the halo, that halo, right? Um, God, that halo, I think is something that reassures relation. In fact, requires relation, right? In that sense.
Yeah, it is. I'm getting that, and you touched on the right participation. It's that's very like I never asked this before. It's like, does God have a left hand? But he doesn't. He just has the right hand because it's all about the right relation.
Yes,
Right?
yes, yes, yes,
And so when, like in Christian theology, when they say he will go and sit at the right hand of the Father,
yes, yes.
it's not this right hand.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like one thing that was coming up for me. It's like if because going back to what we were saying before, like if it's all fact, if it's all predetermined, if it's all known, then why leave, right? So,
Hmm.
so it's a solved puzzle. But I think what you're saying there from Eckhart's work, it's like, yeah, there is a part of this puzzle that is yet to be resolved, and that is,
Yeah.
what we're intimating to as the halo. It's like that right relation, and going back to what I said earlier, it's like having the truth sense or the ability to sense that right relation
Yeah.
then puts us in a situation whereby it's like at least one objective of life is to continuously uh, try and cultivate the right relation
Mm-hmm.
again and again, and
Mm-hmm.
it's it's a fleeting. I would say it's a fleeting success because it's momentary. It's like we have to do it in time
Yeah.
and on repeat again and again. And even when we will learn how to do certain parts, the domain itself is always shifting. And it's like what we're relating to is also alive and in relation to other aspects that hold this whole reality together. And it's sort of like a continuous reality alignment.
Yeah.
It's like we sort of like, we've spoken about creativity before. It's as though in your creativity you're really aligning uh that almost spiritual essence with the reality outside of you, and trying to make the correct expression so that it sort of like gets received well in the reality, and there is that alignment.
Yeah.
But then you have to do it repeatedly so that it seems as though it's one thing, but it's not really. It's all the little repetitions, all the little rituals, all the
Yeah.
all the things you've done from the time you woke up in the morning up to this point right now.
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's sort of
Yeah.
like how I bucket it.
Yeah. In fact, isn't that like the kind of the mistake they discovered in the first level of AI, right? Where they figured out where they thought like, okay, you just put in a bunch of rules. If this, then this. If this, then this. But then they realized like it's only, if A, then B. there has to be a caveat. All things being equal, all things being the same.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, is the thing's never the same, right?
Right.
That thing that's never the same, right? Yeah, what is that thing that's never the same?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What is that thing that's never the same?
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely magnificent. So a few things come to mind. On this kind of weird is that where there are no things, there are situations. And so to meditate on God as no thing, then it's moving to you as thinking of God as a kind of situation, to use a Leibniz term, which makes sense of God as Trinity. And of course, halo, Trinity, dance, these things kind of image and likeness, right? And so there's a few things where what Leibniz wanted to point out in wanting to Descartes is he's basically the argument between geometry and algebra. And Leibniz says, Descartes, buddy, if you try to make the axiomatic basis of mathematics algebraic based on points, you arrive at all sorts of crazy difficulties. And the great Anthony Morley is a master at Leibniz, and I highly suggest his work on it. Where Leibniz says, instead, you need to think of everything at a higher dimensionality, and you avoid all those logical contradictions that we were talking about earlier. And what he points out is that if you have so the great example from the analysis of Cetas is two identical temples. And what things are identical are things that you would confuse as one another if you didn't see them together. So for example, you walk into one and you would think it was the other unless you walked outside and saw them in a situation where they were distinct. And then you would say, oh, those are different. So here's the key. The only way to tell things apart that are similar is by a situation that brings them together. Then you can say, oh, there's a difference, right? So, but here's the key. Similarity is what Leibniz first says is that when Plato talks about form, he's talking about similarity, but similarity is not located in facts. You don't see similarity in facts. You see it in the analogous judgment of the observer of the two similar things that then move them from sameness to similarity. So this is another way to put it. Yeah. Similarity is what you think is sameness unless you see it together.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is, there's no such thing as sameness in reality, because if it's the same, it's just the one, right? So sameness is always a concealment if it is a similarity, right? And you must, sameness is only sameness if you honestly confuse it as being the one of one, right? So here's the trick. In order to always be open to the possibility of the thing that you think is just the one of one, sameness, consistency, internal consistency, you must have your mind on a no thingness, the possibility of a situation that would unveil it as only similar, which if it is similar, that means it has a relation to something like it in reality, but that likeness doesn't exist in reality. This is the weird thing. There is no likeness in reality. Where is the metastructure of cup that makes you identify it with another cup, right? All intelligibility is thanks to an analogous judgment. This is Leibniz's point. It is a judgment, a geometrical judgment of a comparison to a category, none of which is located in facticity. And so realizing that, here's the key, realizing that is the realization of a kind of no thingness. It's not located in the things. It's a realization of the way intelligibility itself works, which is a kind of gathering everything up into a similar mental situation. Because take that temple example, you see the two temples together. Well, what Leibniz is saying is that whenever you compare things in your mind, you're creating a mental situation where you bring things together, right? So, you're bringing them together and then you're comparing them. None of that is located in facticity. It thus means you must create a situation to make sense of anything. But look, where's situation? Where do you find it? Where do you see situation? I see things. I see bookshelf. I see atoms. Where is it? All intelligibility right in front of you. All intelligibility is dependent on something that is not located in the thing in front of you. Yeah. It is located in your relation to the things in front of you. And here's the other key. All intelligibility, this is Leibniz's point as well, but it goes to the halo and the gathering effect. All intelligibility is a kind of gathering. Like when I look at desk, well, I just gathered all this stuff into desk, right? Like when I'm here, when I think about like Apple, I just gathered all my memories into Apple, right? I'm always gathering into situation. I'm taking atoms and points and all those and treating them as if they're not independent. I don't ever treat anything as independent, because even if I'm talking about atoms and acting like atoms exist, I'm bringing them together with my memories of the science class in which I learned about atoms, thus making the notion intelligible and all the other uses. You cannot engage in intelligibility without gathering. So this is like, so what Eckhart is suggesting is if you can meditate upon no thingness, the likelihood of you noticing the gathering that is actually taking in place, that the appearance of a thing and understanding, as Hegel would put it, makes it seem like there's no gathering, just the object, right? Yeah. Just the object. Yeah. If you meditate about no thingness, then you actually notice the gathering. And then I think of how Owen Barfield so brilliantly said that in his book on Saving the Appearances, he said, things are idols. There are no things. You know, if I say that bookshelf is existent, I'm saying it's the ground of its own being. And what's that? Idolatry. So he's also pointing out things and points are kind of idolatry, right? There's only relations. His example is a rainbow. A rainbow only exists because of relations and so on and so forth. So a gathering. So here's the issue. Everything is a gathering, okay? The movement of thought is gathering. And then you step back and you ask, wait a minute, what is gathering like? Well, it's a pulling together. What also pulls? Desire. Wow, intelligibility and desire have a very similar meta structure. And desire actually seems to be able to know things I don't know, because it is kind of running ahead to gather me toward a new gathering. Like desire is trying to pull, like gather you into a new intelligibility where then you can gather anew, right? Which desire would have to go first, because otherwise you would know the thing and already be there. So whenever you're going to enter into new ways of intelligibility, it must be outside of intelligibility or you'd already be doing it. So desire has this kind of pre-rational function of which then, this is the key, like Eckhart talks about, and then I'll pass it on. Desire, like you've said too, Guy, desire is able to desire without knowledge, without knowing, without understanding. It just is able to do it. Well, so Eckhart is like, yeah, desire and no thing goes together. But this is the trick. The pulling toward no thingness is the pulling toward higher modes of intelligibility, more so according to situation, more so according to Halo, more so according to geometry, more so according to Trinity, that must be pre-intelligible before you get there, or you would already be doing it. And if you were already doing it, you might be God. And if you were God, that would be, you know, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? So this relation between desire and knowledge is what would be fitting if indeed human beings are a feedback loop of relation, that in that feedback loop changes their subjectivity, how they understand, which then changes their subjectivity and how they understand evermore.
Yeah. 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 I mean, first of all, so we went down that rabbit hole. How are we doing?
We are doing great. Whenever I'm with you fine people, I'm doing wonderful. And look at all the Legos I have. How could I be doing bad with all these Legos? And I even have a little stuffed animal. So everything is great.
Right. Is there are we at the point where the thing that was driving you crazy about that, have we been able to drive you officially insane, or is it resolved? What's the verdict so far?
There has never been a time where your presence has not been a medication. Your presence has always been a medicine, my dear friend. The madness comes from bringing, going, oh, I need to find those references and notes from Sindler's book, from Kipsky's book, from all of these different things, because all of those greatly strengthen the case that all language is intelligibility is always analogous with experience. Like it is always a movement of a likeness. You're always searching for likeness in thought. Like when I say donkey, the reason that's intelligible to you is because, to use Joel's example from his wonderful book, The Natural Theologian, is because you have experiences that you think of in your memory when I say the word. You don't think of a definition. You refer to a memory that is like the term analogously, AB, not AA, to use Hegelian language. And that likeness, desire, it's not by chance. I always think to play on the desire-knowledge relation. What do we say when you desire someone, you what? You like them, right? What's an analogy? Likeness, right? So likeness as a term suggests the strong connection between knowing and desire, which is always already in operation. Because also, too, when I say the word donkey, you don't like not knowing what it means. So your memory grabs, so your mind grabs the memory because you don't like not knowing, right? We don't like not knowing. That's a kind of a Pierce term, right? Like the ethics of belief. So we like knowing. So when we hear terms, we like to understand them. So we bring in the likeness of memory. And this brings us into intelligibility in the situation that then works on our thinking. So y'all, of course, are on medication. The insanity is always going away, in different things. But it's just very interesting. So yeah, so hopefully keep bringing those together, because then all of that, in my opinion, has to be brought together with Marx. In the sense of, because, you have to reference Marx in an intellectual conversation at least once at some point. It's like your quota or something. And what Marx talks about, and this is why all of this gets linked up with economics, in my opinion, and opening the eye of value, as Stein and Gaffney talk about, and overcoming like game theory, multivariable traps that Schmackenberg talks about. Because here's the trick. The value form under capital is fungibility and commodity, where you see everything like $20, or I see this bookshelf as like $200. So there's an analogy actually in capital. I see everything like it's something else, right? Yeah. If we do not reclaim thought as a movement of likeness, then the economy will do it for us without us owning it. And so it will direct analogy by the value form of the commodity toward the market that leads to the Nash equilibrium, all the stuff Schmackenberg talks about, et cetera, and so forth. So we have to recapture, in a sense, reclaim thought as analogous so that we can create different value forms that direct thought according to likeness in a different way, or otherwise we'll continue to have the analogous structure of thought continue to be moved toward the commodity form, Nash equilibrium, and all these other problems. So all of this, if you took everything we're saying seriously about the halo and the gathering and intelligibility and knowing, this creates an entirely different way to value reality. Ergo, a different value form. Ergo, very different economic models could come about, which are about gathering things versus making things exchangeable according to the commodity form or capital, right? So this leads into the possibility of opening the eye of value, as Zach Stein talks about. So those things go together. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that thing you said about we like to know. We don't like not knowing, right? Like there's something, I think it was Werner Erhard said, like in his very Werner Erhard way, he's like, you think you were born in such a way that anything valid you will understand. Therefore, anything you don't understand is invalid. That's right. God. This
the righteousness, right?
What's that?
The sensibility for righteousness,
yes,
right?
The
truth thing. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, by the way, you guys keep your microphone on, because I noticed in the last video that it just I was making great jokes and I was the only one that was laughing. There was no laughing. He's like, I want to hear the laughter. It's really awkward if y'all are muted and your faces are moving. People, it's just really weird. The party is really weird. Yeah. I mean, you hear my kids laughing too. They laugh at your jokes all the time, secretly behind that door, thinking I don't know they're there. They're laughing their heads off. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and this it's interesting because there's
I'm going through something right now with things around trademarks and services and stuff like this, and it's mind-boggling, right? And in some ways, to kind of like when you get, to get down into it, because you have to have this, you have to hold this. Well, I guess this is one of the reasons, like if we look at law, right? Like we have the laws written, but like when it comes to enforcing them, we have judges and juries and processes, right? So there's something about, just because the law is written, it still has to be interpreted, right? It still has to be decided on, right? And it's funny because no matter how specific you get that law, there's always ambiguity of interpretation, right? So I guess in that way, it's really strange, like you ask questions like, can information be stored? Like when it's stored in the server, while it's in the server, is that information, right? I think what we're saying is
sell by date.
Yeah, because you need someone to disclose it. Like you need you need someone to interpret the information to inform, right? And that's always going to bring in gaps. That's always going to call on new levels, right? Otherwise, we would just have laws and we get the words right, and then it would just be obvious, right? We just send people to jail because they broke the law, and that's really obvious. So you wouldn't need any interpretation. So it's just and it's so funny because this we are like, there's something going on about I don't know. There's something going on about the more, it seems like, technological we get, right? And these contracts that you agree to when you do an app, right? And it's like adding, like they just get bigger and bigger and bigger and more words, right? Like, and I think that probably has a lot to do with what we're talking about, this shift of we'll call it a non-Halo sense of things, right? And it's funny because as basically running an educational organization and in dealing with other human beings, right? We come in various problems where we're like, oh, that must have not been clear, right? So we'll put in the syllabus, right? Right? And no matter how clear we are, like somebody will always go, like, be unclear about it or ask about it or be confused about it, right? Like there's and you can go, if you just kept doing that, right? You would just make another bunch of words to ensure that was clear, and pretty soon, right, we have the thing that no one was going to read anyways, right? It's like there's this but there is something about the Geist, the current Geist, that really does think that if I write it down somewhere and I'm fully informed, that will eliminate having to relate about it. That there really is something like that going on, right? There really is something like that going on. And so, and I guess we can also, I think one of the things that this touches on is, how, for example, if we say IQ, right? Like in the the standard psychological sense of the word, right? Is something about being able to read information quicker, right? And notice patterns and all these kinds of things. But it doesn't have a correlation with wisdom. right? So, someone who with a lower IQ could be wiser than somebody with a higher IQ, right? And so it's because it in some sense, wisdom isn't that like, yeah, it doesn't seem to be about the amplitude of information or quantity of information, right? It has more to do with um kind of like knowing where, like, what's most significant, right? Where reality is, right? What, like, the thing that you just know won't work, right? Mostly it's like the thing that's just, is going to deceive you. There's something, maybe when I start to like look at like this thing about wisdom versus this thing that we usually call intelligence and what they're based in, right? Because there's something real halo like, I think, around that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Touched on quite a few things there, like the obviousness. It's a mystery, right? It's and like and I guess like it goes back to that thing, I'm connecting the two now. Like, we don't like to not know.
Mm-hmm.
I think that motivates the obviousness or the expectation of obviousness. And the thing you said there about thinking that all things that are sensible are going to be intelligible to you, and therefore those that are not intelligible are not sensible. It's like those when you get that and you add the need to know together with that, then you are at a place whereby there is the expectation for obviousness. It's like we just expect it. We want we want it, and so we're gonna work as though it is. And but then it takes you to that challenge you were raising before. It's like when as you try to clarify, uh, you quickly find that you're sort of corrupting the clarification with your perspective. So you would want the clarification to be as independent as possible, as objective as it can be, but you're the one making the clarification. Therefore, it's going to have a part of you in it, which will make it not objective because you can only see from where you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that is where the problems start because like, okay, I explained it to you, Daniel, articulate it. Like Daniel will articulate it with his articulation engine built on his original historical experiences, and you'll say it's blah. And then guy comes and goes like, no, it missed this bit, but he's using a different set, like a whole different historical set, a whole different experiential set. And it's like from where I'm coming from, it would be better if we tweak it this way. Then I'll come in and I'll go like, but yeah, you see, guys, the way I see it, we need to look the thing from the top. And then, yeah, it's not like, and with the motivation to try and fix it and make it solid, uh, then we get into like a combative mode of like, no, 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 Daniel, you're wrong. Guy, you're wrong. I'm right. And but actually, it's more like we're all trying, and this is as much as we've shared it, the few facets that we can, but there's a whole bit that's incomplete, which is the halo we're talking about. And I think that is where the wisdom comes in. And I think going back to the thing of the truth sense, the wisdom is an extension of that truth sense. And in some cases, you could say for some things it could be conscious, but there's a whole lot where it's unconscious. It's like, I can't articulate why this feels right, but it feels right.
Yeah.
And that's all the data I have to go by. And therefore, I'm going to, go with that option.
Yeah.
And and it's deeply rooted in the situational. It's like wisdom is very situational. It's like we try to extrapolate it and sort of like, put it in buckets, kind of like what we were saying before. It's like, write it over here, but it's only in the situation that it unfolds and we get to see its all the colors and shades in it and what it really manifests as. And so uh, the more we do that, the more I think we start to appreciate that we have to go slower, we have to uh, feed in the situation, right? And allow the other, not dismiss the other facets of this emerging truth that we can't fully comprehend.
Yeah.
Maybe we make a step towards a little bit, you'd say a little bit more balance, or a little bit more resonance, or a little bit more harmony that gets us, numbs down our truth sense alarms that are kind of like going off. It's just like the more you adjust, this, some of them go off, and so like, okay, maybe not that bit. Or these are still going off. I still need to adjust for these ones until there's less, because you're going to be setting off others as you move, and the domain is also continuously shifting. So yeah, that's all what's coming to me.
Totally. So I hear in that, I think that what I'm hearing in that is like, yeah, I can't explain propositionally why, but this just feels right in this direction. I notice at least when I've gone against that feeling, like shit goes awry. So like I'm gonna go to that towards that feeling, but it doesn't mean going towards that feeling is the end of the story, right? It's like there's something going on that seems to be an openness to self-correction, right? That openness to self-correction, right, and that ability to self-correct already seems to apprehend something about understanding or knowledge, right? Already, it seems. Is that thing that what was that thing that we said? It was like all things being equal, which is all things are never equal, right? That whatever is all things are never, I think it has maybe relates to whatever that thing is, which I don't know if we named what that thing is yet, though.
I don't think we can name it.
The thing not named, name with a dash through it.
Yeah.
I hear Zoom cancels out background noises, so I'm really sad to say you did not hear my son scream, "I'm a raptor," and jump on his sister, I think, outside the door. But if you did, if Zoom so blessed us, maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's "I'm a raptor," like screaming from the sky. Maybe that's where intelligibility is going. It's all climbing toward being a raptor. I'm thinking that. No, there was someone said that was outstanding. So a few things. A way to think about the Leibniz-Descartes distinction is what we could say the difference between a list and counting. If I say, the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I'm kind of making a list. But if I say 1 apple, 2 apple, 3 apple, 4 apple, Leibniz's point is the only way you count is you judge a quality first. Like the only reason you count things together is because they share a quality, a similarity. Otherwise, you're just listing. And this is really important because what it means is basically it is impossible to count, which is the basis, in a way, of all intelligibility, similarity seen together. Quality goes to quantity, not quantity to quality. Quality is actually first. And this is where the whole modern world is in huge trouble because we're under the what? The reign of quantity, right? Well, with the Groin book, which means we're under the reign of listing, which is chaotic, unrelating randomness. Because you're just listing information. And the great problem is IQ today, IQ tests are testing for people good at listing, not counting, per se. At listing quantities together, not identifying metastructures of quality that they then apprehend together, because that would require doing many things at once, like riding a bike, which would be wisdom following Clayton's understanding of wisdom that time, which I really like because it brings together wisdom with gathering, right? Doing many things to do one thing, gathering many things to do one thing. Like I'm seeing quality between these, gathering together in order to count, not replacing the quality with the quantity. So quality, The problem is, we could say IQ does not necessarily test the ability to apprehend together qualities that are not in preset frameworks. I've heard it said that IQ just simply shows who's good at IQ tests. Now, it's quite clear there is some correlation between IQ and economic success and so on and so forth, but that may simply say that we live in a technological society of which lists, and people who are good at listing are therefore smart. So it's not clear if the test is actually showing that you are intelligent in any and all situations versus intelligent within a situation that is testing to quantity at the expense of quality, per se, to listing at the expense of counting, to algebra at the expense of apprehension. I think wisdom has something to do with quality apprehension. Lenin Pascal has talked about nutritious experience with Gurdjieff, with the ability to make many things into one, but that's going to require us having quality at the basis of things. And I think if quality is at the basis of things, that means a judgment is at the basis of things. And here's the point. Clayton was just speaking very well on this idea of this kind of adjustment. That seems to be the grounds of intelligibility, wisdom, this kind of ability to adjust. Well, what we did in the modern world is say, okay, if there's interpretation, if there's adjustment, that must mean that there's no truth, because you have to adjust, right? That would be like, what did we say earlier? That means we're missing a dimension of intelligibility. We need to bring in a higher dimension of intelligibility, and that dimension is quality. When I'm cooking meat, what do you have to do? Or cooking food, you have to adjust the temperature. You have to add flavors. Do we say, well, I guess the food doesn't exist? No, what we're saying is if you want the food to be good, you're going to adjust things. You don't have to change anything. It's just going to be a really bad meal, right? So, you don't have to interpret anything. You don't have to adjust anything. It's just going to suck. Yeah, well, that's what we've done, right? We said no interpretation, or it's not real, no adjustment, or it's just your opinion. So then all we have is the facts. All we have is reductionism, and it's really bad. Adjustment and interpretation is evidence that quality matters, not that the thing doesn't frickin' exist. Yeah. So what we've done is interpretation is always there, because if interpretation was not there, you'd be dealing with a list, not counting. And when you're dealing with a list, you're dealing with something unintelligible. You can't judge it, like you can't make sense of it. So if you're counting, you are dealing with interpretation, which means you are dealing with adjustment, which means you are dealing with a matter of quality. Yeah. Quality is always customizable, not because the thing doesn't exist, but because the quality, and another way to think about quality is how the thing comes forth, to use more Heideggerian language. Quality is how being comes forth. The quality of a thing is how it comes forth to you. Yeah. Right. And so what does Heidegger constantly talk about? Being has historic episodes, right? Like the historic moment affects how being comes forth. So yes.
Production looks like we're in our 20s, the way we come forth that way. It's our quality being expressed. Okay.
Yeah. And so, that's exactly right. And it actually permeates all of reality in different things. So I am a raptor is the quality of the historic moment of the supremacy that you're supposed to be at all moments, the no thingness screaming, I am raptor versus I am robot. Take that AI, take that Nick Land. So, quality is the way the thing comes forth. But the way the thing comes forth, and this could think of truth and method with Gadamer and art and different things, is relative to our adjustment interpretation to it, right? So the problem is, rather than take interpretation as evidence that we need, rather than take the paradoxes of interpretation we have found through, say, postmodernism or different things, as evidence that we need to bring in quality as a valid basis of frickin' thinking, we've instead said, well, I guess there's no such thing as truth. What if actually quality is an essential part of truth?
Yeah.
Because if quality is an essential part of truth, that would mean truth is situational, because situations are shared qualities. Yeah. That's why it's a situation versus randomness, right? The reason all of this is together is because it's somehow similar in my comprehension as room, because it all has the quality of a room, the aesthetic of a room, and so it all comes together. So it turns out quality is not accidental to truth, to use an Aristotelian tomb. It's essential to truth. Well, if quality is essential to truth, what tends to follow quality? Desire. desire tends to follow quality more than thought, which then makes you think about the quality. So desire tends to be pulled by quality, which then leads quantification of that quality, and we separated ourselves from the origin, to use kind of a Heideggerian sense. We've removed ourselves from the conditions of possibility because quality is the condition of possibility for quantity. We've removed ourselves from quality. Therefore, there's no condition of possibility for intelligibility, and we're in a meaning crisis. Well, yes. Yes, you are, because you removed yourself from the conditions of possibility for intelligibility and removing yourself from quality, which removed you from desire, which is to remove you from what moves thinking and the subject at all. And that's what you see in Dante, Eros. Everything is moved by Eros. That's what you see in Plato. It's all moved by desire. Desire is primary, which makes sense, and then I'll pass it, if quality comes first. If quality leads to quantity, and quality, here's the funny thing about quality. What is quality? In a way, it's a no thing. Quality is not a thing. It's a characteristic of a thing. Well, doesn't that mean it's nothingness? It's situation. Nothingness, no thingness, is evidence that at the basis of intelligibility is actually a situation that is always an excess of a given thing. Yeah. Ergo, a lack is an excess, right? You're lacking the whole because it's beyond your comprehension, because the only way you come to make your desires knowable is one thing at a time, which means it's falling short of the wholeness, but because it falls short of the wholeness, there's movement less left to follow. So then there's more left to do following the movement of desire with quality, which is no thingness as situation, which then I think is what Eckhart is getting at. And then if you take all of this and take it seriously and teach to it and make education in school like that, it would open the eye of value, because you would value quality. You would now, to use Stein's term, you would now move beyond the quality form. And let me put it this way. Marx talks about the value form, and then I'll pass it on. Right now, the value form reflects a world that thinks in terms of quantity at the expense of quality. So the entire economic order does that. If we open the eye of value and realize that quality, no thingness, situation is first, then the value of the society formulates differently with quality at its basis, and then subjectivity in people can formulate differently and start avoiding Nash equilibria, multipolar traps of Smackenberg, climate change, economic downturns, these great stagnation that Keynes talks about. Demand can be created because in a manner that is sustainable, because it is based on a quality that is moving our desire versus our desire being stimulated by flashy objects and advertisement, right? Like what's happening now is our desire is not being moved by a quality, it's being trained by a commercialization to desire things that it knows. You said it very important. You said that desire can want things it doesn't know. And this seems to be the secret of what desire is fitting for. Yeah. The economic model right now wants you to desire things by showing them to you. Capophatic. It's very capophatic. You see the ad, you see it, you want it. This is disordered desire. Because desire is fitting when it wants something it doesn't know. When desire wants something it knows, that it is seen on TV, it's not being used for what desire is supposed to be used for. Desire is supposed to be used in service of the apophatic. We don't have a capitalism that does that, though. A desire that is service of the capophatic is one that is led by unknowability, that then leads your desire toward that unknowability beyond the commodity form, beyond the marketing and advertisements. So now we have something that is far more creative versus simply consumeristic.
Yeah. So so basically the quality is like the blind spot that we have. Yeah, it's like the blind spot that we have. I guess Evan Thompson wrote a book here called The Blind Spot of Science, right? And it sounds to me it's like if you say science is scientism, right? Specifically, right? It's kind of this, it's this, well, it's the thing that can't be measured or like what you're talking about, right? It can't be summarized in a quantitative way, right? Um, and basically kind of science for the most part, right, can get you things in terms of quantity. I guess so there's some parts of biology and things like that that are doing something different now, but like um for the most part, like as we understand it, science yeah, it's at some levels when we made the product of what we could quantify the and called that the really real, right? That's where it's like we started to become blind to the the quality. I think comes first essentially. um and we don't include that in the maps that we make of the real, right? And then we have to have all these other things come along, right? Like I don't know, subjectivity, and then we get in all these kinds of all the way down, right? Yeah, that was amazing with just the way that you pulled all that together. I really appreciated that. And I want
Well,
to
I think that association, just as a quick note, that association with the blind spot is brilliant. And I think also I should note to spot quality is to spot similarity, otherwise it's chaos. If you're spotting similarity, you're automatically in metaphysics. You're dealing with Platonic forms, would be Leibniz's point. So if quality comes first, that means metaphysics is at the basis of all economic orders. That also means forms are real, like they are real. And basically what has occurred is we no longer think in terms of forms. So we have no formulation and thus the society cannot be formulated because it has no form. So
yeah.
it can't orbit. And so it begins to, when you don't have a formulation, you stagnate because you stop moving. You look economically great stagnation. The subjectivity doesn't stagnate. So by losing quality, we can't have formulation.
Yeah.
And then of course you can't have beauty, only aesthetics, because beauty is a strike of quality at the most supreme manner. But I just wanted to add that, and I think the economic ramifications are huge. Please.
Yeah, so when you're describing that, the formulation and the quality, the relationship, so something that came to me before while you're giving that other beautiful description was the whole, it's kind of like there's this need to kill things a little bit for us to attain precision, right? It's like you give the example with the food. It's like we'll take the food and then we'll do this dance with it and get it to a certain state. But even when it gets to a certain state, it's kind of like we've transformed its truthfulness into a different state, but then it's also temporal. It's like it's going to change. Like if you don't put it in the fridge, it start to go bad. If the fruit's ripe on the tree and you don't take it off, it will go bad. The truth is moving. The truth state that it's holding is in motion. And so what that was saying to me was sort of like it's like this domain of truth is it's in flux. However, there's this other desire for the absolute truth. And so we try to absorb truth of its movement
Yeah.
and then fix it, sort of like to have it precise, like a fact, right? And then I think that's when the struggle starts with between the relationship between the quality and forms. And because like we're working on this assumption that if it is true, therefore it should be static. We are not accounting for the dynamic core nature of truth. It's like, yeah, it is true now. It will still be true later. However, it's shifting, it's in flux, it's in movement of some sort, and we have to keep up with the truth. Otherwise, we get out of it, and then we're the ones who die, or maybe just sort of like become overly precise. We can't move again. You could describe it that way. So I don't know, like, is that in line with what you're unfolding there, Daniel? Yeah.
Oh no, I think it's brilliant, and you know, not to switch up the language on you with the absolute, because what you're saying I completely agree with. So when Cadell and I will talk on Hegel, where for Hegel the absolute must entail a certain encounter with limit, but this limit is actually kind of pregnant. And the limit is precise. The absolute is the fact that you're always encountering a certain limitation to intelligibility, which is part of the intelligibility, which is why it is active and temporal and becoming. Becoming is a key term. So a way I put it, not to switch the language on you, but is like Wittgenstein says that the truth is everything that is the case. The way to put it for us is that in Hegel, the truth is everything that is the case plus us, which changes what is the case, which changes us, which changes when the case, on and on and on. And you are limited from ever not being in that participatory process. And the encounter of the limitation, which you could say is when I look at that bookshelf, another limit, because what we're describing is an epistemology that is always moving. Thought is always moving. Hegel would say it is passing over into otherness. So thought is like desire, because what is desire? It moves you, right? We could say so much of our trouble is that we've had thought have a different metastructure from desire. So they don't go together, they don't dance well. And when they don't dance well, quality and quantity don't dance well, and we get all sorts of paradoxes that we then take as evidence that thought doesn't exist. Great. So anyway, like Hegel would say, when you look at a tree and I ask you, what is a tree? I say, well, it has roots, it has branches, it has leaves. What are you doing? You're passing over into otherness. You go from tree to branch to leaf. You can't define anything without passing over into otherness. A way to think of that halo is that it's including otherness. Like it's growing to include your experience, a new particularity. And I should note, I meant to say this, that halo works by adjustment and interpretation and experimentation. Like what do we talk, how is science possible? It's supposed to be experimentation, right? But we don't take experimentation as evidence that science doesn't exist. And yet interpretation, which is basically experimentation for the subject, is evidence that subjectivity doesn't exist. And so what experimentation is to science, interpretation and adjustment is to subjectivity, is to the humanities, is to quality, and the halo is a process of that adjustment and interpretation, which is a kind of experimentation to figure out what fits under this halo and what doesn't, right? But it's a passing over into otherness. The halo expands. And then when I say, oh, the tree includes the branches, the leaves, the roots, the car. No, bring your halo back. It doesn't include the car. Car is not part of tree. Your halo's gotten too expansive there. The situation is too broad. Well, what did you do? It hit a limit. So the absoluteness of the tree arose at an encounter with a limitation that is in an automatic relationship with something it is not. So there's a kind of relationship automatically there that is based on you could then say, Hegel be like, so it's set up for love, right? Like all knowledge is an encounter with a limit, otherness, now the possibility of relation and love. So, the logic of love and God all kind of goes together. So, but how do you know? Here's the trick. Why do you just know that the concept of tree does not include car? Where does that come from? Comes from experience, comes from a judgment, an analogous judgment that works. Just because it's an analogous judgment doesn't mean it doesn't work. Just because it's an interpretation doesn't mean it doesn't work. It works because it is based on participation in life, realizing there are limitations to concepts based on your encounters with reality. And so here's the trick. The encounter of limitation, which is possible with the subject who analogously judges those limitations, is part of the absolute truth. That is the unfolding of the absolute versus a stagnant definition. But in a sense, that entire thing I just described is a fixed situation. That is the situation of intelligibility. So in a way, there's a fixedness, but it's a fixedness as a description that entails an aliveness in it. So that is how, for me, you get a balance between a kind of truth, a solid absolute, but one that's moving. A way that Alex Ebert has described it with becoming is putting the be in parentheses. So being entails a becoming. It's not becoming or being. It's that what constitutes being is essentially a becoming of a kind of adjustment relative to the encounters of limitation that it then incorporates into itself, creates with, and then moves beyond those limitations precisely by bringing in another dimension of intelligibility. It then brings in a higher level of intelligibility. And this is the movement of thought through history that Hegel describes basically as absolute idealism. Like the reason thought has to develop through history. And a lot of people say, oh, so he's saying we become more rational through time and blah, 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 blah. In a way, but there's a reason why he uses the term reason versus rational. So he makes all these fun distinctions because that's what philosophers love to do, make little distinctions between terms, and it's all fun. But anyway, but the development, here's the key, the development of philosophy, Geist, spirit, reason, is a participatory encounter with limitation that then is incorporated into the movement of the absolute, which is the movement of the halo, which then changes the subject that can only be found in error. This is the key. Like he says, the fear of error is the fear of truth. So what does that mean? What he's saying is that the only way for the absolute to develop is by encountering its limitation. You literally screw up. You don't know there's a limit there, because here's another key point. A limit must surprise you. Otherwise, it's not a limit. You knew about it. So it's not really a limitation because it's under your power. You knew about it, right? A limit must surprise you, which by definition means it must be outside your brain. It must be encountered in the concrete, and it must make you feel stupid because you didn't know it was there. So, but that feeling, I am stupid, is precisely the development of thought. That's the funny move in Hegel. You get smarter because you find out you're stupid, not because you become smarter. The only way to become smarter is to encounter your stupidity. Well, that sounds like no-thangness, apophatic, encountering what you didn't know. That is the movement of thought. That is the absolute. And this is where what Hegel would say, Clayton. He would say the absolute is the fact that the only way to get smarter is to encounter your stupidity. That's absolute. You can't get around it. That's the absolute. Absolute knowing is knowing that the only way to get closer to the absolute, to get smarter, is to encounter your stupidity. And if you avoid and this is what Hegel would also say, if you never encounter your stupidity, then by definition, you're going to think you've got the absolute knowledge because you never encountered error, which would precisely be evidence that you don't have it. Because you never encountered the limitation, which means you're in your little tribe, you're in your ideology, and you never encounter what's outside of it. So if you think you have the absolute because you've never encountered error, Hegel would be like, that is precisely evidence that you don't have it. But encountering over and over again your stupidity is evidence that you are participating in the movement of the absolute without ever having the fullness of the absolute. And I think this is kind of how theology and apophatic thought works, right? And here's the last point, and then I'll pass it. That experience must be relational. There is no possibility of encountering your stupidity and it not being a relation because you don't think of yourself as stupid. You can't. If you think of yourself as not knowing something, you know you don't know it. So it actually isn't stupidity. If you say you're bad at math, you know you're bad at math, so it's not actually the encounter of limitation or stupidity, right? To actually encounter limitation, it must be with something external. It must be an encounter. It must be a relation, right? The only way to actually deal with the apophatic, to come into the geometrical, to make, is in the participation and the encounter, which then, of course, would suggest that the correct way to do education is a lot more relational, dialogos, conversation, stuff like we're doing versus memorization. Because when you memorize something, you know that you know it or know that you don't. Therefore, there's not an encounter with surprise. And this is why the dialogos, the circling method, is absolutely necessary for the movement of the absolute, because that is the only way you can have surprise. What happens in circling and dialogos all the time? You are surprised. You are surprised. You are surprised. That is the character. That is the absolute characteristic of the absolute. That is the unfolding. If that is not occurring, Hegel would question. Well, Hegel would say you're understanding, but you're not reasoning. You're in understanding. You're not in wisdom. You have understanding, but you're not gathering. And if you're not gathering, you're not in the movement of spirit. And then, of course, the question would be, if indeed the movement of thought is a gathering, the phenomenological question would be, if all of experience and all of thought is gathering, what are the conditions of possibility and reality that would make it to where thought is most fitting as a gathering? Well, one would suggest that reality in its essence has a gathering characteristic. Reality in its and then Hegel would be like, yes, because reality is a becoming, a passing over, a becoming something more, a movement of different things, which sounds like a dance, which sounds like a description of like C.S. Lewis on the Trinity, which sounds like the apophatic movement, which sounds like becoming. So all the very fact that thought is like this suggests that reality is like this, absolutely. And the more one aligns with it, economically, in terms of education, in terms of subject, the more one aligns with things, and so the more fitting would become. But the question that then I think so much rides upon, okay, Dan, that all sounds great, but what if that's just an illusion of reflexivity, of the subject reflecting on itself, which creates an eternal regression, versus some sort of indication of a great apophatic mystery that one can then choose how they interpret, right? Because you could just say that everything we're describing sounds nifty, but what if it's just like an effect of reflexivity? Like when you have two mirrors, Hofstadter's example, when you have two mirrors look and it creates an infinity, there's not actually an infinity hallway, right? It's just an effect of two mirrors looking at one another, right? So what if everything I'm describing or just said is simply a effect of reality or thought reflecting on thought, but it actually is not getting at anything substantive, right? It's not getting at anything. Well, this is why we were saying at the beginning, why I think it's very important to realize if in every other case, paradox is an indication of a higher intelligibility needing to be brought into the forefront, why would we ever suspect that it would be different in this case? Why should, if we can deal with Zeno's paradoxes and all these other paradoxes by bringing in another level of intelligibility, why would it be the case that this effect that we are describing is simply a paradox that suggests the non-existence of the apophatic thing that creates this becoming? You understand what I'm saying? That would be different from all the other paradoxes. What if there's just a level of intelligibility that is missing, which is the capital M mystery, which is the apophatic, that we would by definition have to posit because the thing is something that you could not, as a human being with your finitude, bring into the fullness of your intelligibility. And this is where a faith step, like an ultimate concern, kind of a faith step would be necessary, what I call an absolute choice. So I think it works to that.
Yeah. Regarding the positing, so I haven't read the book. I haven't read Zach's book yet. What's it called? The Eye of Value.
Eye of Value. Yep.
Like values and first principles.
Yeah, first principle. That's it.
And it makes me wonder about like how do principles first? How do they first? Right? Like in some sense. And I'm imagining kind of like is the word that discloses this mystery that we're positing, is that what is it fair to say that like it's quality?
Yes.
The qualitative dimension, right? That continually it presupposes and also transcends any of our quantification, right? Like it always exceeds itself or leaps out of itself when you try to look straight at it, right? But it presupposes everything in terms of the way things hang together, requiring this withdrawal. So is that a positing? Because there's something interesting about the way I think where did I first read this? I think it was Ivo De Janeiro, right, where he talks about a principle, and that there's something about the word principle as he follows the etymology that basically means seize, right? There's a seizing, something seizes, right? When you come near it, it like starts to gather and seize, right? And there's this element about it kind of takes because the problem with like when I hear first principle, like my head looks at like I don't know, like a stake in the ground or something. I get some kind of vision of like, you know, there's just a stake in the ground and this is first, and why? Because we say so, or it's posited or something like this is kind of singular, I don't know, stake or something. So my question is like, how does the principle first, right? So that's my question.
It's a really good question. Clayton,
Oh,
please.
go ahead. No, I was noodling on it. Like one thing that quickly came to mind was like what I do, like in my line of work, you have to innovate sometimes. And I relate that to the first principles because like when you're traversing a space that hasn't been solved for, well, you can't get it wrong. It's like anything you do is going to be right because, well, there's nothing else to compare it to.
Mm-hmm.
And so my intimation towards that is the first principles first in that they were the first to show up. It's like when we were ideating about how should we, let's say, arrange this Zoom call, right? It's like, what's the order? So we don't know. Well, let's get on, and this is the order we have. It's like it seems to be working, but then maybe after 30, 40 calls, we may go like, you know what? Maybe it would be of better quality if we shifted it in this other direction from the fast, right? It's like we do, and then we would shift, and then we would sense into whether it got worse or if it got better.
Yeah.
And then we would decide to stay there or continue there. So
Yeah.
I think the first principles do first in that they were the first to manifest in that in that situation or scenario. Uh, if there was a better example, it would have been the first.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. What's your take on it, Daniel?
No, I think it's magnificent. So, with the book where they're talking McGillicuddy, there's I think axiology, which is the notion of the study of value, and there's this kind of idea that value is part of nature. That in the sense, if you have God as first mover, what if value is actually what kind of comes first in nature? How would that transform things? And McGillicuddy makes examples of basically it's impossible not to value. And if valuing is everywhere, then why not say value is part of reality, which I'm sympathetic to, because we are basically saying that quality is part of essence, that judgment is part of essence. It is impossible to have intelligibility without value. Well, where is value, dang it? It seems to be found in a relation. So there is certainly, Gaffney talked about cosmic eroticism, which I think ties to this notion of desire and the movement of thought and different things. So there's this idea that value is part of reality. Well, if value is part of reality, then you're not probably going to have a sustainable society if it's out of whack with value or it doesn't think about value because it's misaligned with reality. And there's a classical notion in philosophy that if you're out of alignment with reality, you're in a privation and a lack of substance, we could say, which leads to auto-cannibalism, eating yourself, and so on and so forth. So, I'm very sympathetic to that. I think what's very interesting with the notion, so on the problem of positing, which is wonderful, so the funny thing about interpretation is I could interpret something as being there that actually is there, and yet I still have to go through interpretation. So I could, in a sense, be actually more so realizing, but it has to be through a structure of interpretation to engage in a realization of something that is there that I am observing, though, in relation to as itself. So it all becomes quite tricky, right? Now, if there was not interpretation, there could not be realization, only isness. And if there was just isness, there would be rocks dreaming, right, of nothing, right? There would not be subjectivity. So you have to have interpretation, have the possibility of realization. And realization is very interesting because realization is where the subject and the object very strongly align in a way that suggests there is no division. and yet that suggests distinction. Well, how do you have distinction without division, right? Well, that's a situation. There's a difference between the bookshelf and the laptop and me. I always make the bookshelf example because there's a bookshelf right there. So it's the most at hand. Heidegger was right about that whole at handness stuff, right? So it's my favorite example. But anyway, it's distinct. There are distinctions, and yet there's no division. Well, that's weird. Realization suggests how you can have distinction without division. It is actually a testament to a relation. A relationship is not sameness. A relationship is only possible because of difference. That's what's freaking weird. Like, relationships are always testaments to difference. Otherwise, it'd be sameness and an equal sign, and an equal sign is not a relation. An equal sign means there's just one thing. That's the weird thing. Relations always suggest there's difference in the claim of a similarity that closes that difference while also affirming it. That's really weird. And all intelligibility is doing that thing. That paradox is always an operation of thought. So when we talk about positing, positing must be an act of interpretation that is actually more so a realization of an isness that is not merely a statement of fact. It has to be relational, right? Also, critically, positing as interpreting as possibly realization would be the epistemological structure that makes possible freedom, human freedom. The fact that I have to interpret means I'm free. Because if I just read, I wouldn't have a possibility of making a mistake. Freedom requires the possibility of making a mistake. Like, if you couldn't make a mistake, you couldn't be free, right? Interpretation is the possibility of a mistake that means you are free. And if you are free, you can meaningfully relate to that which you are interpreting. So likewise, you can meaningfully relate to that which you are positing. So positing means there's freedom. Like, another way to put it, like, if you're a Christian and you believe God exists, there's a sense in which you're positing God exists, but there's another sense in which you're only seeming to posit exists because God gives us enough distance to freely choose him. So there's an appearance of positing, but it's actually more so a realization. So then the question is the following. If we posit quality as first, which is actually to claim it is a realization, not a mere positing, that it is a realization of what is always already, what would be the basis for believing that, right? What would be the basis for that positing that wouldn't make it merely a claim, but give us reason to think that positing is actually a realization? Beauty. Beauty to me is massive. Beauty, the fate of beauty is the fate of us, I like to say. And Thomas Jockin has a class coming up on beauty, and everyone should take it because Thomas Jockin is the man on beauty. Beauty is really important because when I experience beauty, I experience something that is absolutely external to me and yet says to me, I am. It is there. It's screaming at you. It seizes you. Jockin and I will talk about the strike of beauty. And now critically, beauty is different from aesthetic, like a mere aesthetic, right? Like, one of the great mistakes, this is the other insanity realm, is making the distinctions between what I call a meta-aesthetic and a beauty, to throw as many terms into one conversation as possible, is that when I look, like Roger Scruton makes the example that when you look at a dining room and you see the table is set and the forks are everywhere, you go, oh, that's fitting. That's how a room is supposed to look. We use the word beauty to describe that, but I think it's more so an aesthetic, and I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying that experience of beauty, a set table in a nice room where everything is vacuumed and all that, is very distinct from the Rilke poem of seeing the statue that screams, you must change your life, the strike of beauty, or the sunset, or the thing that captures you in your sun that's beautiful, that just seizes you, right? And actually conflating aesthetic and beauty has contributed to some trouble, because beauty is evidence that the external world exists, that it's not just your head, slophism or something, because it strikes you. If it is possible for the human being to have an experience of something that strikes you as clearly in excess to you, that also is distinct from you, then on the basis of that experience, it is reasonable to posit that quality is primary on the basis of the experience of beauty, to thus believe your positing is actually a realization of isness. Because you encounter beauty, you always encounter beauty. Beauty always surprises, and we've said all through. So therefore, beauty, and I think basically the absolute idea at the end of the science of logic can be associated with beauty in Hegel, and Cadell has made this point as well. History advances by encounters of beauty. And beauty does indeed tell you how stupid you are. Oh, you think you know everything? Really? Look at this. All right. No, I don't know much. Beauty always is a reminder you don't know, so you got a long way to go. But that's a good thing because now you have meaning because there's a long way to go and I have something to do, right? So you don't have boredom. Beauty, the way Burke, and then I'll pass it. Burke described the sublime. Well, Burke described the joy that can come from feeling small. Like when you see a massive thunderstorm and you feel this thing that's greater than you and in excess to you, and actually you are relating to it, but you're not relating to its fullness. There's a kind of joy that comes in that smallness to go, oh my gosh, I'm actually not the world. Wow, there's a world beyond me, and it feels like it holds you. There's something that can hold you. There's now because it screams the possibility of grace. If there is something that you are small compared to, then there could be a source of grace that could catch you, that could hold you, that would be there, even if you're not. And so there's a kind of comfort, there's a kind of joy that comes in that. Now, he also makes interesting distinctions between the sublime and the beautiful in Burke, and I think we can associate the sublime with the death drive. But anyway, so beauty says to you, you are small, you are glad you are small. It says to you there's an external world that you can relate to, which then becomes, because of that encounter, of which surprised you, it is then reasonable to think that intelligibility works through surprise, that the basis of reality is, in fact, something that is primarily quality. And so to posit that as a first principle is to posit value and quality as a first principle as a realization of isness. Beauty doesn't need your idea that it exists. Beauty's there without your idea that it exists or not. The apophatic doesn't need you to believe in it. It's there. You can. You're invited. Come on. But it doesn't need you. The problem with some talk, if we're not careful, of axioms and overly epistemological language, is it can suggest a kind of what Joel talks about as coherencism. Like the world will only be this way if I believe it's this way. I have to have the right axioms and I create the right system, right? That's the danger of overly epistemological language. But by emphasizing beauty, I think we can suggest this. It's here. You want to be in the dance or not? It's up to you based on how you freely choose to relate to it. So for me, beauty becomes really central to all of this because it becomes the basis of positing an inexhaustibility that is what we should expect if quality is primary, of which then makes the halo primary, which then makes these kind of discussions a development of a halo, which makes adjustment interpretation primary, and then learning and wisdom is precisely the mastering of the art of that adjustment, that movement and that freedom relative to beauty.
Right. Yeah, this kind of siege, that way that something like art can enter you, right? Yeah. Before you can think your way into it, or it's like the thatness of something, right? Like the difference. I think I was talking about this before, this conversation I had with my wife about the difference between these moments when my son, who's 2.5, like does something cute, and you experience what gets disclosed is his adorableness, right? His cuteness. And it's what's interesting about that experience is, like, if the higher it is, like the more you just want to do something like eat them, like, or it's like you can't take it, right? It's like too much, right? Or something like that. There's this kind of like just cuteness, right? But then there's these other moments that we were talking about where my wife says, but then there's these moments where he's beautiful. It's a totally different sense, right? Like it's kind of this thing that you can't ever, like, in the experience of it is inherently is this thing that you can't deduce, right? And the increasing of it, right, isn't going to bring on like a too muchness, right? And It may dissolve your consciousness, but like of a total different kind, right? Which is really interesting. And in our conversation, I asked her like, well, what's the difference between the two, right? What's the difference that makes a difference? And where where we kind of landed is it seems that when he's cute, it seems to arise on some way he is, right? Or somehow he is, how or what or way he is, right? Like, but in beauty, what gets disclosed are these moments where that he is. And thatness is such an interesting thing to think about, right? Because you can't locate that. Everything presupposes that if it's real, we're like, of course, it's that it is. We know it's obvious. I'm relating to it. It's here. Da, 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 da. But like, if you go, well, how do you know it? What gives you it's that? It's that. You're just going to describe hows and whats, right? And so this dimension of thatness, um, it's like something like beauty seems to really be remarkable at disclosing it, right? It's being seized by it in some sense.
Yeah, that is. And I guess that's how the first principles fast by expressing their isness in a way that fits the situational reality.
Yeah.
At least that's what I'm getting. Yeah, it's like because I was noodling on that in the background. It's like plant the first stake, hammer it in. It's like,
Yeah.
well, reality could say no at any one point. It's like you could start and there's like a big, strong,
Yeah.
granite rock at the bottom and it will bounce off and goes like, no, sorry, no stakes allowed here. You need something else. And so, like, reality can reject the expression of the isness at any one point. And the moment you'd say if the moment there is a successful expression of an isness, then we have a first principle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Isness that first principle. And there is this way, right? Like, in some sense, like Heidegger, right? There's a few different Heidegger Hegels, right? But I mean, one of them is the one who completed a whole kind of thought, right? That I think from Heidegger's standpoint is what he's stepping off of to realizing its end, right? And I think what he was referring to is this thing that happened during that time from all these philosophers of this necessity for a system, a totalizing system of some kind, right? Um, and I think for Heidegger, this is this is my kind of an understanding of it. For Heidegger, right? Um, what what the ending of that, right, disclosed, right, was that there was something significant about the desire for a system or the strange necessity. Because when you look at that period of time, and you look at the idealists, right, like during that time, and you just look at it, right, and kind of just without judgment or presuppositions, it's so fucking strange. Like, it's really strange. Like, all is like, we got to come up with the system that completes everything. Like this, what the hell was that? What was so significant about that, right? Like, in some sense, it, you know, and I think so. So for Heidegger, he says like what that showed, right, in some way is the move. And what Heidegger, I think, was doing was saying that, like, no, we can't, that significance, right? Meaning in the deepest sense of the word, right? Um, cannot be summarized, right, in a final sense. And therefore the task is interpretation. And I think what he meant by interpretation was that you're forever in interpretation, you're disclosing something, right? Or an attempt to disclose something, but that thing that you disclose, you can't analyze or summarize or turn it into information, right? Like it can't be a product of your thought. That like we're constantly finding sources of significance, but those sources, right, aren't of our own accord, right? We are, in fact, we kind of find our way already underway of them, the thing that's important. And so it's this new mode for Heidegger where he stopped doing kind of like a systemized thing that he saw Hegel and everyone else doing, and it's this other mode um, of disclosing sources of significance. And the question is, it's a really interesting question, and I actually, speaking of mothers and children's, I need to get going here. But I think one of the questions I have is, in some sense, I think we probably all agree that the whole modernist thing, right, that we're all in some sense inside of, maybe some would say are dissolving out of, some would say are carrying through, right? Gave us human rights, gave us all these things that I think that I wouldn't want to not have. However, like, but also is pretty thin, right? It's pretty thin. And so I think what am I trying to say? It's like that move towards calculation, that move towards, right, the non-halo thing has been a movement that's been going on for a long time. And which shows that there's been something that, like, there's something significant there that, like, had us go in that direction. What was it that we were seeing? Why were we doing that, right? Why was like philosophy a forgetfulness of being, right? Like, what were we looking for there? Like, why did that happen at all? I think is something that I think is still worthy of, or coming into understanding of. But now I think that we're all in the project, whether or not we know it or not. I mean, I think even this conversation is, if I don't know what to call it other than an attempt to the re-enchantment of the world, right? Now, like, not the enchantment of the world as it was before, because, like, it went unenchanted. So to enchant it again is going to include that right? And in some sense, this is the project that I think all continental philosophy is doing that, right? At some level, we're all responding to that at some level.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe we could pick that rabbit hole up in the next conversation. I have a few minutes, so if you guys want to, like, say some stuff before we.
Well, I loved all of that, and I always appreciate the chance to speak with you wonderful people. So thank you for the opportunity, and I think you put that all very, very well. In order to basically, for spirit to advance, for the absolute to advance, there has to be an end of plausible deniability, because otherwise you don't emotionally develop. So you have to go through the period where thought can make a system that is internally consistent. It actually can make these cathedrals. And in a way, it has to do it to reach the place where it can no longer plausibly deny that will not be sufficient. Yeah. But there's a way in which, unless you go through the error, You don't remove the plausible deniability so you don't have the emotional transformation. And if knowledge follows desire and it follows emotion, you have to do that. So you have to go through these historic episodes where you encounter a limit of a thing that must be tried, must be encountered, must be practiced to end the plausible deniability, because human motivation is such that if we can keep rationalizing, we will, as long as possible. If we can still have plausible deniability, we're going to keep it going. So there's a way in which you have to go through that, please.
That must is interesting.
Yes. Yes. And this is where in Hegel, there's a very, very weird determinism that is determining you must make a choice. This is the weird move. You are determined because you're going to reach the place where you can no longer deny that systems aren't sufficient, even if they play a role. But Hegel would not say at that point, you must change your life. That's where freedom is found at the moment of choosing. And it's a pure freedom because you can't deny the case. So it's kind of just because you know the case, and yet you can still choose to go against the case. Similar to Lucifer. Well, Lucifer knows God exists. That's why Lucifer, as the highest angel, becomes the highest demon in a way, automatically, because there's no plausible deniability of what he's doing, and yet he was still able to do it, right? And so now, without going too much down that theological rabbit hole, because there might not be a deeper rabbit hole than the fall of Lucifer, there's a notion where choice emerges where plausible deniability ends, precisely because you cannot deny what you are choosing. And thus it is purely free. And so history has to move through this very weird, somewhat deterministic structure. Determination would use the more Hegelian term of arriving you at a choice that is very much a real choice. So history is progressive in Hegel. There is a progress, but that progress can be by choice ended at any moment. Just because if there's a future in Hegel, it will be better than the past, but there's no guarantee there's a future. Because at the points of total saturation, as Alex Ebert perks it, we can make a choice to deny it all the same. And that would be true damnation. And basically, to the point that we've said about modernity and the gains of it in human rights, in computer science, they talk about overfitting and underfitting. If I use these terms incorrectly, Clayton, just throw up. I'll see you do it and know I'm doing it wrong. The problem is right now, what I'll say, the value form of capital, which was necessary in order to create global pluralism and technology and the internet and human rights and all of these things, is now as an autonomous sociological organizer reaching an overfitting point. It's no longer adequate. It was necessary to get technology that allows us to do Zoom and talk, to give us global pluralism, to even create pluralism, basically, so we could interact with people who are very different from us on terms of market so we could relate intelligibly. But now we're at the place where that's reductionist and you got to take your training shoes off. The capital commodity form, in a sense, have been training shoes so that we get to the place where we're able to have the global infrastructure that makes pluralism possible. But now, if we don't move to what I would call value form competition or opening the eye of value or moving toward beauty as value form, then we're overfitting. And then what's happening is the plausible deniability is being removed that global capitalism alone can keep us going. Like that's the Hegelian move. That's what's happening with the meta crisis, the meaning crisis, the plausible deniability that capital as an autonomous, the only value form, the only organizer of political economy, et cetera, so forth, is sufficient. It was reasonable to posit that for a historic episode between, say, maybe 1830 and 2020, but now it is overfitting. And Hegel would be like, hey, guys, if you overfit at the point of plausible deniability running out, the consequences can be quite dire. So you now have to, the term he would use is negate or negate sublate this value form into the next phase. And that would be what I would associate with the re-enchantment of the world. And that is going to have a lot to do to look ahead and then pass it off for Clue, with the capacity for to spread the conditions by which the average person is able to be hit by thatness versus merely cuteness. Thatness, meaning the world discloses itself as entailing a beauty that attracts you, which then can be the basis of an intrinsic motivation versus an extrinsic motivation, which would then make it possible for capitalism or the market to stay in non-zero sumness versus fall into zero sumness as a result of only extrinsically stimulating demand, according to Apophatic advertisement and different things. So if you can get people to see thatness, that inherently creates what? Desire, but not a desire, here's the trick, of owning and possessing, but a desire of ever honoring. You want to honor that thing, not control it. Well, you've always got something to do because it's always outside the realm of your control. And what do we as human beings tend to do as soon as we get something? Not want it anymore. So then we need a new dopamine thing. Thatness is a thing that can ever formulate desire without ever it being captured and thus stopping to be a source of desire because now you own it. So in thatness being a source of motivation, we now have an intrinsic motivation which can reformat the organization of the market to becoming something that's sustainable versus necessarily based on consumption, which a motivation that is extrinsic must be consumption-based. And if it is consumption-based, it will fall into the multipolar traps and game theory dynamics that Mr. Smackenberg is talking about. And so thatness is also possibly experienced relative to any phenomenon in reality, because all reality entail a particularity in thatness. Thus, it can be the basis of leaving Cato's play on your own, which is the opening of Belonging Again too, as the problem that has to be addressed if you're not dragged, which could be thatness. And thatness, here's the final point. Thatness is what comes forth in the clearing. Heidegger is big on moving toward clearing, because if you clear aside everything and you move toward a philosophy of clearing, then if something comes forth, you know it has to be of its own terms, not yours, because all you did was clear. You didn't apophatically create anything. You figured out what you needed to do to be present and clear, and that is the epistemological activity by which thatness can come forth, that then can work on your desires, work on your loves, change your habits, change the formulation of your knowledge, and now we have a different subjectivity that can give us a different political economic order that is now fitting for this historic moment, that until now wasn't fitting, not because it was wrong, but because it was fitting for that moment. But we are now at the saturation point where the plausible deniability is out and the negation, sublation, and absolute choice is necessary, which is based on this clearing, on this collective experience to have that thatness, which then can move us toward the love that moves the sun and other stars.
Beautiful.
Any last words, Clayton?
No, I have nothing to add to that.
Beautiful.
I love you.
It's like, exactly. Mwah.
I love you.
Much love, my friends.
Much love, my friends. I've really enjoyed it. Always a pleasure.
We're going to do this again soon.
Me too.
Yes.
Bye.
Yeah. See you on the next one.